He was silent, overlooked, and standing in the most dangerous place in the palace. Because in a universe where power announced itself loudly, no one accounted for a quiet human who saw everything. The court had perfected the art of making silence loud. Every pause vibrated with layered protocols, translated etiquette, and the faint irritation of nobles waiting for someone else to embarrass themselves first. The human guard stood where he always stood, which was to say, exactly where no one's attention naturally landed. He had learned that if you remained still long enough in a room full of beings obsessed with status displays, you effectively became furniture. Functional, ignored, occasionally leaned against by accident. He didn't mind. Furniture rarely got blamed for diplomatic incidents. The Queen's court was in session, which meant arguments dressed up as philosophy were floating through the air in neatly color-coded speech bubbles. The translation field struggled valiantly, lagging whenever someone insisted on using an ancient ceremonial dialect purely to sound important. The human listened anyway. He always did. Listening was cheap, and it made other people nervous when they realized too late that you'd been doing it the whole time. Someone was ranting about border security, waving 6 fingers, and a hologram that kept flickering into an image of a very angry asteroid. The human noted distantly that the asteroid was actually 3 weeks out of date. He did not point this out. Pointing things out was how you stopped being invisible. A ripple passed through the chamber, subtle but unmistakable. The Queen had shifted her attention. He noticed it not because he was special, but because he was bored. Boredom sharpened perception. The Queen's gaze slid past generals, advisors, and genetically optimized courtiers like a system scan dismissing non-critical files. It stopped on him. He resisted the urge to check his uniform for stains. Humans had a habit of assuming attention meant trouble. In this court, it usually did. The Queen spoke his designation aloud, and the chamber reacted as though gravity had briefly taken offense. Several nobles turned, clearly surprised that the background had learned to talk back. "You," she said, and then paused as if tasting the simplicity of it. "Do you find this discussion useful?" The human considered several answers, rejected most of them, and settled on the truth, lightly wrapped. "It's very impressive," he said. "I've never seen so many beings agree so passionately about different things at the same time." There was a delay while the translators processed irony. Then a laugh escaped the Queen before she could stop it. It wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. It detonated anyway. The court froze. A noble dropped his hologram, which immediately began projecting the wrong asteroid again, as if out of spite. The Queen tilted her head, studying the human with open curiosity now. "You are assigned to observation duty," she said. "Yes, Your Radiance." "And yet you observe," she replied, amused. "Most guards merely stand." "Standing is observation with less paperwork," he said, before thinking better of it. Another pause. Someone in the back hissed in scandal. The Queen smiled wider. She dismissed the ongoing argument with a flick of her hand, causing several dignitaries to stumble mid-righteousness. "Court recess," she announced. "I require a second opinion." The human found himself walking beside her through corridors that hummed with alien circuitry and gossip traveling faster than light. He said nothing, because nothing was still working for him. She spoke first. "You do not posture," she said. "I'm bad at it," he admitted. "My shoulders never remember the angles." She laughed again, openly this time. "You see flaws in my court." "I see habits," he said. "Flaws are just habits that stop being useful." She stopped walking. He stopped too, because walking past a queen was a career-limiting move. "You are dangerous," she said, not unkindly. He considered that. "Only if someone asks the wrong question." Her eyes gleamed with interest. Somewhere deep in the palace systems, an alert chimed softly. Something fundamental had shifted, and everyone else would feel it soon. The human returned to his post later, once again part of the background. But the court no longer forgot where he stood. And the silence, for the first time in centuries, sounded nervous. By the time the court reconvened, the human guard had already been promoted 3 times in rumor alone. None of the promotions came with benefits, authority, or a pay increase, but several came with elaborate backstories involving espionage, forbidden romances, and at least one completely fabricated duel with a 6-legged duke who, inconveniently, was still alive and very confused. The human returned to his usual position anyway. He stood where he had always stood, slightly to the left of a pillar that radiated a low-level force field and occasional disappointment. The pillar had been there longer than most of the nobles and had a better reputation. He nodded to it out of habit. The queen arrived late, which was her privilege and her hobby. When she entered, the court straightened in unison, like a school of fish suddenly remembering predators existed. Her green skin caught the ambient light in shifting shades, and her long ears angled back in a way that suggested she was listening to several frequencies of nonsense at once. Her blonde hair was braided differently today. That alone caused 3 minor political factions to form and immediately disagree about what it meant. The human noticed. He always noticed. He also noticed that the palace security grid had been recalibrated overnight, poorly. The sensors were now too sensitive, mistaking dramatic hand gestures for acts of aggression. 2 nobles were briefly restrained by shimmering energy cuffs after arguing too enthusiastically about trade routes. The queen watched this with mild interest, then waved the cuffs away. "Relax," she said. "If I wished you restrained, you would not be debating." That helped, slightly. Proceedings resumed. They always did. The court loved nothing more than resuming. The human listened as representatives argued about expansion zones, resource allocations, and the philosophical implications of a star that had recently decided to explode slightly earlier than predicted. Someone blamed humans. The human did not object. Blame, like gravity, was easier to accept than to fight. Midway through a particularly long-winded speech, the queen glanced toward him again. This time she didn't pretend it was accidental. "Guard," she said, "what do you think?" The speaker faltered, visibly offended that his monologue had been interrupted by a species without ceremonial spines. The human weighed his options carefully. Silence would be interpreted as humility. Speaking would be interpreted as treason. He chose the third option. "I think," he said slowly, "that if the star explodes, none of us will care whose policy was correct." The translation field hesitated, then rendered the statement with brutal clarity. A murmur spread through the court. The queen leaned forward. "And before it explodes, then I recommend shorter meetings," he said, "just in case." For a moment no one reacted. Then the queen laughed, sharp and bright, and the tension cracked just enough for air to get in. Even a few nobles joined in, mostly because laughing late was safer than not laughing at all. She dismissed the speaker with a gesture and turned fully toward the human. "You simplify," she said. "That is dangerous." "I'm told complexity is safer," he replied, "but it does tend to trip people." She regarded him for a long moment. "Walk with me." The court collectively inhaled and did not exhale. The human stepped away from the pillar, which immediately felt offended, and followed her into the inner corridors. The walls here whispered data and history, projecting faint echoes of past rulers who had also believed they were in control. "You are not ambitious," the queen said as they walked. "No," he agreed. "Ambition requires hope." She smiled at that. "And yet you disrupt my court." "Only by standing in it," he said. "It was already unstable." They stopped near a viewport overlooking the city below, a sprawl of alien architecture and hovering transit lanes that obeyed physics only when supervised. The queen folded her hands behind her back. "They fear you," she said. "That seems inefficient," he replied. "I don't even have a desk." She laughed again, softer this time. "You see what others miss. You say what others decorate." "I'm human," he said. "We're very bad at decoration." She turned to face him, her expression thoughtful. "Stay where you are," she said. "Do not change." He nodded. I was planning not to. When he returned to his post, the court watched him like a loose variable. He stood, silent as ever, but now silence bent around him differently. The nobles resumed their debates, but their words had lost some of their weight. Somewhere between laughter and fear, the hierarchy had begun to wobble. The human listened, patient, invisible in the only way that mattered. He had no intention of overturning anything, which, he knew from experience, made him the most dangerous thing in the room. By the third session after the Queen began asking the human questions, the court had developed a nervous tic. It manifested as excessive throat clearing, over-polished ceremonial armor, and a sudden spike in requests for historical precedents that no one actually intended to follow. The human guard noticed all of it. He had always noticed. The difference now was that people were noticing him noticing. The Queen arrived precisely on time, which unsettled everyone more than her lateness ever had. Precision implied intent. She took her seat without ceremony and let the silence stretch. The human stood at his usual place, posture relaxed, expression unreadable in the way humans were often accused of weaponizing. "Before we begin," the Queen said, "I have reviewed the security assessments." Several advisors stiffened. One of them glanced at the human with open suspicion. "They are thorough," she continued. "They are complex. They are also wrong." The room stirred. A general opened his mouth, then reconsidered his life choices and closed it again. "The palace defense grid has been optimized for threats that announce themselves," the Queen said. "Armadas, assassins, loud ideas. It is poorly suited to quiet failures." Her gaze slid deliberately to the human. "He noticed this," she said. "He mentioned it casually while being ignored." A noble could not contain himself. "Your Radiance," he snapped. "This is highly irregular. He is human." "Yes," the Queen replied. "I am aware. I approve the species import." The human cleared his throat. "For the record, I was not imported. I applied." A ripple of laughter moved through the chamber, unwilling but undeniable. Even the noble faltered. The Queen raised a hand. "The point," she said, "is not that he is exceptional. It is that we assumed he was not." She stood, descending the dais slowly, deliberately closing the distance between ruler and guard. The court leaned forward as one, as though proximity might clarify what was happening. "You have all mistaken silence for emptiness," she said, "and noise for authority." She stopped beside the human. "What do you think happens next?" she asked him. He considered the question. "You'll be challenged," he said, "by tradition, by pride, possibly by someone with too many medals and not enough imagination." As if summoned, the noble stepped forward, face flushed. "This has gone far enough. You undermine the court, elevate an outsider, and call it insight." The Queen regarded him calmly. "You fear change," she said. "I fear chaos," he shot back. The human shrugged. "Chaos doesn't usually announce itself," he said. "It just keeps showing up to meetings." That earned a few snorts. The noble rounded on him. "You think yourself clever." "No," the human said. "I think I've been paying attention." The Queen smiled. "And that," she said, "is why he will remain." She turned back to the court. "The guard will be reassigned. He will advise on matters of perception, security, and unintended consequences." A stunned silence followed. Then quietly, "That role does not exist," someone whispered. "It does now," the Queen said. "I checked." The human felt something unfamiliar settle into place. Not ambition, not power, responsibility. He exhaled slowly. "I should warn you," he said. "I'm still going to stand quietly." "I would be disappointed if you didn't," the Queen replied. The days that followed were strange but manageable. The human spoke rarely, but when he did, meetings ended sooner, defenses improved, and arguments lost their theatrical edge. The court adjusted, grumbling all the while. Some nobles avoided him. Others tried to provoke him into revealing hidden agendas. He had none. That confused them deeply. The Queen changed too. She listened more, laughed more, ruled with a lighter hand and a sharper eye. She no longer mistook ceremony for stability. One evening, as the palace lights dimmed and the city hummed below, she stood beside him at the viewport again. "You never sought this," she said. "No," he agreed, "but I don't regret it." She nodded. "You have altered this place." "Only a little," he said. "It wanted to change." She studied him, green skin glowing softly in the reflected stars. "You are no longer invisible." He smiled faintly. "I know." The court behind them buzzed with debate, laughter, and the uneasy comfort of a hierarchy learning to breathe differently. The human guard stood at ease, no longer overlooked, no longer underestimated, and still exactly himself. For the first time, the silence of the court felt calm.